Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Capital Gains Show. My name is Aaron. I'm here to talk about capitalism and talk about socialism and defend the former and criticize the latter. Today, I want to talk real quick about a specific argument that I have been hearing socialists throw at capitalism. They say, you need the state to protect private property rights. Well, I want to get into that a little bit today. It is true currently that the state sometimes protects private property, but it's not necessary to have a state to protect private property. This is like a variation, really, of a who will build the roads kind of argument. What they do is they look at the government, which is visibly doing some kind of service, and then they have a failure of imagination and say that no other type of entity could possibly provide that type of service. Well, you know what? There's already private roads, there's already private road builders, there's already private road owners, and the same thing goes for security purposes, essentially, and contract enforcement. You can have private security, you can have private contract enforcement. And in fact, most security provided in America today, I'm talking about like physical security of real estate properties, right, is done by private entities. Most guns that are used to defend life and property are in private hands, at least in America. And contract enforcement is very popular for a service that is performed on the private market. And in fact, a lot of contracts that people get into with their banks and stuff or their phone company will say that they should try and do private arbitration should a dispute occur. And the real reason for that is that the private arbitration costs less and it's faster. And there's more consumer choice involved. And they generally get better results. So what it really is a failure of imagination. Oh, I can't believe that anyone could do this aside from government. Well, there's a lot of places out there where people say that, whether government provides healthcare, it couldn't possibly be provided privately. Well, it is, and the best hospitals are privately owned hospitals, and the best practices are the private practices, not the government practices. Okay, and there's a fundamental rule that happens when it comes to free markets and private property rights in different societies today. They're all basically variations of mixed economies, all these different countries out there. But the ones that have more private property and more free markets and more wealth accumulation are the ones where the government has a comparatively smaller footprint. And by smaller footprint, I mean the government. There's two ways the government can have a big or small footprint in a country. It can be through a lot of regulatory burden, or it can be through having a lot of direct government ownership of the means of production and the means and housing and things like that. Now, the places that have more capitalism and more private property rights tend to have less restrictive government rules and tend to have less direct government involvement in the means of production. So if you really want to get rid of capitalism, then you need like total government, right? You need total government rules. Everything has to be centrally planned and democratically controlled and publicly owned. That's the only way to get rid of capitalism. So to say that you need government to protect capitalism, well, if that's true, then you need a lot more government to get rid of capitalism. And the more government you have, the less capitalism you have, and vice versa. That's just what you see when you look at history, when you look at what's happening today. Okay, and there's another thing. We already have a lot of examples today of private entities that operate without government protection and in fact operate in defiance of the government actively trying to prohibit their existence and trying to shut them down. And that of course is the black market. Now, when people think of the black market, they think of all these criminals that are violent, drug dealers and kidnappers and stuff. Well, the vast majority of black market activity is not violent, it's not fraudulent, it doesn't involve theft. I mean, unless you count not paying taxes to the government a form of theft. I don't. But what happens is people are doing business deals without the government saying that it's okay that they do that. And for example, in Cuba, the black market is bigger than the official economy. So what you've got is living proof that a lot of capital activity is already happening, totally absent government assistance and or government protection, and totally in defiance of the government actively working against them. So it's the argument that capitalism needs a state to protect it is wrong, both in theory and also in what you see on the streets today. Okay, so you can have private property protected privately or publicly. In hybrid systems that we see today, private property is protected by both. Also, we do see in the hybrid systems that exist today that public property is protected sometimes by private entities, sometimes by public entities. Sometimes public property is protected by the government directly, sometimes the government outsources it and contracts it to some private security entity that can do it cheaper or whatever. So here's the thing though, if you have a totally socialized and planned economy and you don't allow private property, then you're going to have to protect your public property with the government. You're going to have total government protection of everything and total government control. So you're going to have more government the less capitalism that you have. See, private property is not unique in its need for protection. All property needs protection. Public property is not exempt from that. And in fact, public property is usually victimized and exploited worse and vandalized worse than private property is when you look at what's happening in the world today. So, and that's because the public property is the one that suffers from tragedy of the commons, and it's not as adequately defended. People don't care as much, not on an individual level. They only care on an arbitrary, abstract level. So the private property is the one that tends to be more protected, especially when it's protected privately. And a lot of, I mean, you look at America and say, well, every piece of property in America is protected by the police. A lot of it's supplanted by private property. You know, you have private alarm systems. You have private armed response that you call. You know, you have private video cameras and motion sensors, and you have private attorneys that file cases against those that steal or aggress against you. So it's very true that private property can be privately protected, and in fact it is better protected when it's privately protected. And the more socialism you want to do, the more government you're going to have to rely on to protect all your property. And the more government you have, having more government is the only way that you can stop capitalism, that you can reduce capitalism. You're going to have to take the capitalism, you have to cut it out and replace it with government. That's what you're going to have to do. And in fact, the largest violator, the greatest violator in terms of the profoundness of the violation and the frequency and severity of it is government. No one violates private property rights more than government does. Now, private property can be violated by other private entities, and it is, but the government does the most of that by far. So the more protected you want your property to be, the more you have to put that protection in private hands, either in yourself or outsource it to a private entity. You're just going to get a better quality service that way, just like you get better quality roads when they're private. They're less congested and they're better maintained and they're safer. Just like private music is better and private food is better. You know, the best cheese is privately made cheese from artisanal farms, not government cheese. Come on, man. It doesn't matter. It's the same thing for private security. So I want to conclude this video by saying that public property is more vulnerable to the argument that you need government to protect it than private property is. Private property is far less vulnerable to the you need government for protection argument than public property is. The more public your property, the more government protection you're going to need, and the less you're going to be able to rely on private property. That's the truth.